Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Welcome to our live chat, our fireside chat. This one is called Application Availability in 2020 and Beyond. And we are very excited to have Rurik Wilmot with the Harris County District Attorney Office here to chat with us today. And to give you a little background, the Harris County District Attorney's Office is dedicated to making our community safer through evidence-based prosecution and equal justice for all. They have an office comprised of 329 prosecutors, 90 investigators, and 277 support personnel. So it's a fairly large community and district attorney's office that he works for the IT department for. And I think we have some very interesting stories and things to talk about. So, Rurik, if you want to take a few minutes and introduce yourself, that would be great.
So as you mentioned, thank you, Frank, for having us this morning. My name is Rurik Wilmot. I work for the Harris County District Attorney's Office. I currently serve as the Infrastructure and Application System Manager. Prior to that, I was one of the members of the infrastructure team, and our main goal is to provide support services for the office, make sure that all of the enterprise systems are constantly available.
Awesome. Thank you, Rurik. And we're here to talk today because I want to discuss a project that y'all did several years ago where you worked on, if I remember correctly in our earlier discussions, a project to really provide high availability and some disaster recovery redundancy and availability for your enterprise applications. And obviously, the network and the application that you use in your business, in your line of work is in the DA's office is critical. You have very time-sensitive issues. You've got a lot of things going on in the legal system. There's a lot of different pieces of information. It's a very complicated, at least from my perspective, it's a very complicated environment, and more power to you for dealing with it. But can you tell me a little bit about why y'all decided to start this project and the process that y'all went through?
Sure. So when we started, we were a small infrastructure team. We came in, I started working here in 2014, and the first part of that infrastructure project is obviously to get to know what you have currently. So after doing a survey of the existing equipment and the site, we quickly discovered that we had no disaster recovery availability. We had a disaster recovery site, but for us to fail over to DR, we would literally have to spin up backup copies of information. So that would basically put the office in a protracted downtime while we brought up services in the disaster recovery site. And that could be a problem. As you mentioned, legal things they're time sensitive. People have due process, so we can't have protracted periods of records that are unavailable to service the various attorneys that are going out and prosecuting at the various trials. So one of the projects we started was to refresh the infrastructure. So we had a 3-tier infrastructure prior, which was servers, network, and SAN storage, which was an isolated silo in each site. What we moved to was a hyper-converged infrastructure. And while we were switching over, we kind of talking amongst the infrastructure team and said, wouldn't it be neat if we could have services not only in the DR site, but have it to where if we had a failure in the primary site, the DR site could pick up and wouldn't miss a beat. And that's where we started to kind of reach out to various vendors and start investigating load balancing.
So to create this DR capability, and like you just said, before, or the original model was this manual process. You had a failure at your main site of your applications, and you had to then manually build and put things up in the alternate site or location to make things available for people. And obviously it requires time, requires effort, requires people resources. And like you said, your business is very timely. You need the information available.
Exactly.
And so load balancing, how did load balancing for you solve that problem, and how did you move forward with implementing that load balancing solution?
Well, after we investigated our needs and various vendors, we settled on the Kemp Loadmasters. We have 4 LM4000s. We have 2 in our primary site and 2 in our disaster recovery site. And we started with just load balancing in the primary site, where we could have multiple web servers through our load balancer, and we could spread that load across multiple virtual machines that sat on multiple nodes. And that worked great, but we still had a process where we would have to manually bring up service in the other site. Then we discovered that the KEMPs had the ability to do what's called GSLB, which is Global Server Load Balancing. And it's pretty neat. It actually takes your FQDN, or your fully qualified domain name, and it can spread that across multiple IP addresses. In our case, 2 different subnets and 2 different sites. So when we had a server or an application fail in one site, the KEMP could redirect traffic to the disaster recovery site without missing a beat, so to speak. So we put it up and started to test it with some very low-hanging fruit. Just in case we had any issues, it wouldn't cause, mass hysteria, so to speak. And all of our testing went well. After we tested on, as I mentioned, the low-hanging fruit, we decided to move to a more latency-sensitive application, which was our on-prem exchange. And we were able to not only load balance the servers in each site, but load balance across sites. So we could now literally take servers out of service, and there would be no interruption. We had an instance where the next morning we came in and we noticed that our exchange system was responding on the disaster recovery IP. And it turned out that the servers in our primary site had undergone a bad Windows update and had the blue screen of death. But the load balancers were able to send the traffic to our disaster recovery site with no problem. We came in and noticed it, brought everything back online, and no one was ever the wiser.
So that's awesome story at multiple points. Number one, you implemented the local load balancing, so you can have multiple servers, and you can take servers in and out of service as necessary for maintenance or whatever purposes that you need. Or if one has a blue screen of death, then it automatically redirects. And then you had the global load balancing, and that story is really cool, that the global load balancing was able to do that disaster recovery automatically for you. Mm-hmm. And maybe in the middle of the night, when that Windows update tried to occur at 2 a.m, like my laptop does all the time or something like that, right? When I'm not there. And you did not even notice your customers, your legal team, your support staff. Nobody didn't even notice until you came in the morning and just noticed the logs or the alerts or things to say, oh my gosh, the servers were down.
That's correct.
So, I mean, this is from a network operations perspective, this is kind of like one of the holy grails that people want to try to achieve, where they say, yeah, things go down, things automatically fix themselves, mm-hmm. and nobody wakes me up.
Exactly.
I remember back in my days when I was on your side of the fence managing networks and dealing with things, I used to carry like a cell phone and 2 pagers.
I remember those days.
So anytime something happened, one of those devices is going off and I'd have to scramble and fix things. But now you had a situation where these things are happening automatically for you, and that gives you the flexibility and I'll say leisure to take your time and identify and fix things properly.
Exactly.
So
I give kudos not only to the technology, but also to our team. We've adopted a mentality where if you notice me, then there's a problem. If you don't notice me, then everything is operational. And that's the mentality that we try to keep in infrastructure. If you don't notice me, then everything is working as it should. But if you notice me, then there's a problem. Something is down. And that's what we try to avoid.
Oh, absolutely. And one thing when we were talking previously, preparing for this, you mentioned that one of the concerns that you had and one of the reasons you really needed this disaster recovery is that your primary site is on-site data center.
That's correct.
And I think you mentioned something about having flooding problems and things like that, where you needed some way to be able to provide that quick recovery through other options. So can you walk through a little bit about what your environment looks like and what you use for your disaster recovery site and how you're really taking advantage of that?
Sure. So prior to me starting with the office, The building had undergone flooding during Hurricane Allison. That was in 2001, I believe. I started in 2014. And when I saw some of the images of that flood, we decided, we have to find a way to get applications and services to be able to fail over to our disaster recovery site in a timely fashion. We went in with the hyperconverged infrastructure in 2015. We bought the load balancers very early 2016 and started to migrate everything over to that hyperconverged infrastructure. And we literally finished it. I think we finished the migration of everything, all of the virtual machines. We got rid of all of our physical servers except the nodes that actually service the hyperconverged infrastructure. And we finished that in mid 2017. And we found it funny that after we set everything up and we said, hey, we've got a neat infrastructure, it can fail over, it can do all of this great stuff. In August of 2017, Hurricane Harvey came and it flooded the building again. And that was like a real world test of our failover capabilities to be able to move service to disaster recovery, because our primary site was in the physical building that flooded. Our disaster recovery site was about 35 miles away or so. So it was safe from the floodwaters. So when that night, when it started to rain, my boss called me and said, hey, it's raining pretty heavily. We may get a little flooding. And I thought to myself, oh, it's not going to be that bad. The next morning, he sent me a picture with water like up to his chest. And said, the building is closed and they're getting ready to turn off the power. And I was like, oh, no, that's not good. So we quickly, got the team together, assessed what we needed to do, whether this would be a short-term or a long-term outage. And it seemed that it was going to be a long-term power outage because of the flood water. So we decided to fail everything over to our disaster recovery site, and everything failed over as expected. We didn't lose a beat. We were up during Hurricane Harvey, even though the downtown area was offline, and our office could continue to function and communicate with each other.
That's really awesome. And that's great hearing that. And it reinforces I think two facts. One is that failures are going to happen.
Definitely.
Whether you can plan and predict and do everything you can to mitigate the failures, like we're doing with load balancing technology and the global load balancing disaster recovery, but failures are going to happen. Whether it's a technology failure like this, the blue screen of death, or server failure, or whether it's Mother Nature type failure. Yeah, like flooding and hurricanes, and I deal with that here. I live in North Carolina, and I deal with hurricanes, so I know exactly how bad it can be. And having that disaster recovery, having that off-site capability, whether it's a third party that is you're providing hosting somewhere miles away, or whether it's something in some sort of cloud infrastructure, if you want to use some cloud technologies. Having that disaster recovery, though, is turning out to be critical.
Definitely.
And this is something that I think is very interesting, and it's great hearing the story from you, because usually when we talk about these things and talk about disaster recovery and failover and redundancy and things, people tend to think, oh, this only applies to these really big companies like the Walmarts and the Home Depots and the airlines and things like. But really and truly, this applies to so many different organizations and so many verticals at different levels and different sizes. And even though y'all support the legal services for a single county, you're still a pretty large organization, and no matter how large you are, the information, the timeliness of information, and the applications is going to be relevant no matter what.
Exactly, it's critical.
Absolutely. So, I mean, this helps reinforce to me that we are doing the right things and doing cool things. So now that you have all this in place, and obviously things have changed in 2020 a bit, right?
A bit.
As you can see, I'm working out of my home office, and I got my cluttered bookshelf behind me with all the different things. You happen to be, I'll say, lucky and are able to go into the office today. People might say it's not, but I'll say you're lucky, or it's nice that you are able to go in the office today. But how has this environment changed how you consider and deal with IT, and how you make sure your application is available, and how does that change your thought process moving forward?
That's a good question. I don't think it really changes the thought process moving forward. I think
Mhm.
the process we had initially was correct to make sure that you have services available in two sites. They have to be desperate sites. You don't want them to be right next to each other in case of some disaster, natural disaster, or even a man-made disaster. Somebody cuts through the fiber on the construction crew or something that's going to knock out both sites if they're very close together. Um, I will say that not having the same physical access to the data center that we had before because of the pandemic we're going through, we have to kind of be more uh, uh, separated from each other, from individuals. It gives me a little relief to know that my disaster recovery site is available in an instant. So although I can't get to my primary site if there's an issue, we can always fail over to DR, and when I can schedule an opportunity to get into my primary site, repair whatever needs to be repaired, and then we can fail back, and hopefully, if everything is working as it should, we shouldn't miss a beat. The users shouldn't notice any cutovers from site to site.
Absolutely, and I wholeheartedly agree. the The fact that you don't have access to the physical infrastructure like you had in the past, where you're in the office every single day, you can just walk down to the closet or to the communications room and plug things, unplug things, go onto a terminal and fix things locally. It, it's much harder, especially if you weren't in the office every day like me, and I would have to drive, 10 miles or even possibly fly to get to my location.
Mhm.
It's just not convenient. And having that automatic capability, I agree, it gives you such comfort knowing that is there and it's going to work, and excuse me, it's going to help you maintain that application assurance
Yeah.
for your customers.
You know,
Wonderful.
one thing I'd like to mention, you mentioned there about some people have the mentality that it's, for large customers or large companies rather, like the Walmarts or the Amazons or whatever the case may be. And some may even have the attitude that I don't need disaster recovery because that's just infrastructure that's sitting there not doing anything, and that's costing me money.
Hmm.
But the question is, it may cost you a little capital to get it set up, but how much is it going to cost you if you don't have it and your primary site goes offline? So for us, if we were still stuck in a single site scenario or a dual site where we would have to actually spin everything up one by one in the DR site, which would take countless hours, what is the cost in not only man hours to get it up and operational, but the cost in man hours of time that has been lost from the start of the outage until you're back up? So that's something to keep in mind as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Excuse me. And I can't imagine the cost, not only in terms of dollars and man hours for a business like you, and I'll call you a business, even though you're a great public service, um, where district attorney's office, if your information and stuff is not available, what happens to the legal system? Doesn't just stop and say, okay, we're going to wait till you're up and running.
Exactly.
Things still happen. Courts and judges still make decisions, and it's not going to be good,
Exactly.
the outcome.
Show must
So
go on, as they say.
yes, exactly. So yeah, this has been a great conversation. I really appreciate it. Uh, give me one last parting statement, Rurik, if you can, to the people listening. What do you recommend that they think about and they do in terms of their disaster recovery strategies, if they don't have, or if they do, in terms of what they should be looking to do?
Well, if you don't have a disaster recovery site now or a disaster recovery plan, I would really start to think about why don't you have one, and if you do meet up with a disaster, what is going to be the cost of you meeting that disaster without being able to bring your services up? Some people say it's it's an RGE. It's a resume generating event if you don't have the time to recover. So I don't want that. So we've had the opportunity to revamp our infrastructure to make sure that we have availability in 2 sites. And although we're not the largest of companies, we notice or recognize the fact that service to customers is very important. And so we want to make sure that we have their information available at any time, whether it be, again, man-made disaster cutting through fiber on the street corner, or natural disaster that's something that's more unpredictable. So I would really highly suggest that even if you're a small shop, that you go through some kind of disaster recovery plan, whether you have it physically in another site or some cloud service that is a pay-as-you-go. That way you can keep services at a minimum in the cloud, and then when you need them, you can spin them up, and you're only paying for that time that you're using in the cloud. But I do think it's an essential service.
I completely agree. And Rurik, thank you. Thank you to the Harris County District Attorney's Office for letting you take the time to talk with us and talk with everybody about this. I've really enjoyed our chat and our conversation, and
Likewise.
Hopefully everybody else as well. And thank you to everybody for joining this. And we look forward to seeing you again in our next chat. I appreciate it. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks again, Frank.